Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. In the chilling winter of 1692, the quiet Puritan settlement of Salem, Massachusetts, transformed almost overnight into a place of paranoia, accusation, and deadly consequences. With eerie visuals of snow-covered colonial streets, candlelit courtrooms, and shadowy figures whispering behind closed doors, the opening moments immerse the viewer in a world on the brink of madness. A haunting voiceover sets the tone. In 1692, hysteria gripped a small town in Massachusetts. But what really caused the Salem Witch Trials? It wasn't just about superstition or religious fervor. There were deeper, darker forces at play. Tensions over land, class divides, personal vendettas, and even secret medical theories swirled beneath the surface, waiting to ignite. The hook teases the untold layers of the Salem story, building anticipation by promising to reveal surprising truths and hidden motivations that traditional history books often overlook. The atmosphere is thick with suspense, reinforced by unsettling background music and quick flashes of historical imagery, gallows, scribbled accusations, trembling hands. The viewer is pulled in not just by the mystery of what happened, but by the provocative question, why did it happen, and could it have all been avoided? In 17th century Massachusetts, Puritan society was built on a rigid foundation of religious absolutism and a constant, looming fear of moral failure. The Puritans believed they were a chosen people tasked with building a godly community, a city upon a hill, watched not only by their neighbors but by God himself. Every action, every misstep, was interpreted through a spiritual lens. Success was divine favor. Misfortune was divine punishment. At the heart of their worldview was an intense fear of the devil and his earthly agents, witches, who were thought to work in secret, corrupting the pure and leading the faithful astray. This fear wasn't abstract, it was visceral and ever-present. Daily life was austere and emotionally repressive, and in the absence of entertainment or personal freedom, paranoia and religious zeal often filled the vacuum. The divide between Salem village and Salem town was not just geographic, it was psychological, economic, and cultural. Salem Village, located inland, was made up primarily of subsistence farmers who lived a hard, isolated life governed by traditional Puritan values. These villagers were deeply suspicious of outsiders and protective of their way of life. They viewed the growth and prosperity of Salem town, which thrived on trade, commerce, and increasing ties to the outside world, as a threat not only to their livelihoods but to their spiritual purity. To them, the town's embrace of material, wealth, and cosmopolitanism was a slippery slope toward moral decay. This divide manifested in real, tangible tensions. The villagers resented paying taxes to support a town church they didn't attend and a government they didn't fully trust. Disputes frequently erupted over land ownership, particularly between newer, wealthier settlers and older farming families. The appointment of ministers in the village became a point of fierce contention, especially when ministers like Samuel Parris, who had ties to the town, took hardline positions or demanded compensation that many in the village saw as greedy or unspiritual. These grievances accumulated like dry tinder. Religious extremism compounded the problem. In this community, the devil wasn't an abstract concept, but a living, lurking presence. Any misfortune, whether it was a failed crop, a dead infant, or a sudden illness, could be interpreted as the work of Satan and, by extension, his earthly agents, witches. This worldview created an environment where suspicion, fear, and accusation were logical reactions to unexplained hardship. In the minds of the people, evil was not only real, but contagious, and purging it became a divine duty. Thus, when young girls in Salem Village began exhibiting strange behaviors and accusing neighbors of witchcraft, it wasn't dismissed as fantasy or illness. It was taken as confirmation of all the villagers' fears. The trials that followed were not a random outburst of hysteria, but a violent culmination of years of simmering resentment, distrust, and spiritual dread. In many ways, the witch trials functioned as a catharsis, a brutal way for a fractured community to try and rid itself of its demons, both real and imagined. The explosion of accusations was a tragic attempt to restore a sense of control in a world that felt increasingly unstable and morally unmoored. The Salem Witch Trials erupted when two young girls, Betty Parris and Abigail Williams, niece and daughter of Reverend Samuel Parris, began experiencing bizarre, unexplained fits in early 1692. They screamed, contorted, and claimed to see visions of strange apparitions tormenting them. At a time when people believed strongly in the supernatural, such behavior was immediately attributed to witchcraft. Under pressure to explain their afflictions, the girls accused several local women of being witches. Among the first was Tituba, an enslaved woman of African and indigenous descent owned by Reverend Parris. Her confession, possibly coerced or given in self-preservation, added fuel to the fire. She spoke of witches working with the devil and even described fantastical imagery like black dogs and strange books, painting a vivid picture of a satanic conspiracy that gripped the village's imagination. From there, the accusations snowballed. Fear and paranoia spread like wildfire, and soon neighbors were turning on each other. Over 200 people were accused of witchcraft within just a few months. The trials themselves were chaotic and deeply flawed. One of the most controversial aspects was the acceptance of spectral evidence, claims by accusers that they had seen a person's spirit or shape in dreams or visions harming them, even if the accused had an alibi or no physical evidence linked them to the act. Judges like John Hathorne, ancestor of author Nathaniel Hawthorne, accepted these claims as legitimate proof. In this climate, denial often worsened a person's case, while confession, real or false, could spare one's life, creating a twisted incentive to lie. Public confessions, often made under extraordinary psychological and social duress, played a central role in escalating the witchcraft panic that gripped colonial Massachusetts during the Salem Witch Trials. These confessions, many of which were likely false or coerced, acted as fuel for the growing hysteria, reinforcing the belief that a vast and hidden network of witches was actively working with the devil to undermine the Puritan community. Each admission, no matter how fantastical, was treated not with skepticism, but with urgency, seemingly validating fears that Satan's influence was spreading. The courts, rather than serving as impartial venues for justice, became arenas of fear, where spectral evidence, dreams, visions, and the invisible torment of supposed victims was accepted as valid proof of guilt. The resulting legal proceedings were deeply flawed, driven more by panic and religious fervor than by reason or evidence. The influence of figures like Reverend Samuel Parris, who cast the events in overtly spiritual terms and used his authority to stoke the flames of fear, was pivotal. Judge John Hathorne, one of the chief magistrates, pursued convictions with unwavering zeal, often dismissing the lack of physical proof in favor of emotional testimony and spectral accusations. As a result, 20 individuals, 14 women and 6 men, were sentenced to death by hanging, and Giles Corey, in an act of resistance, refused to enter a plea and was gruesomely pressed to death under heavy stones. Beyond those executed, many more languished and perished in jail, awaiting trials that might never come. What had begun as a mysterious illness among a few young girls quickly unraveled into a full-blown moral and spiritual crisis, fueled by the volatile intersection of fear, religious dogma, and systemic injustice. The Salem Witch Trials became one of the most notorious instances of mass hysteria in American history, serving as a powerful and enduring lesson in the dangers of allowing fear and ideology to override due process and rational judgment. The II tragedy revealed how quickly a community could turn on itself when guided by paranoia and the fervent belief that invisible evil was lurking within. The Salem Witch Trials remain one of the most puzzling and disturbing chapters in American history, and historians have developed several compelling theories to explain the psychological and social forces that led to such a devastating outburst of fear and violence. One prominent explanation involves mass hysteria and psychological contagion. In the tightly controlled, religiously rigid Puritan society of 17th century Massachusetts, people, especially young girls, were under intense emotional and spiritual pressure. Repressed desires, fear of damnation, and the harsh realities of colonial life created a volatile psychological environment. The constant threat of Native American attacks from the ongoing King William's War only heightened this stress. The settlers in Salem had experienced real trauma. Villages were attacked, families murdered, and entire communities uprooted. Against Yo. This background of fear and uncertainty, strange physical symptoms, convulsions, trances, hallucinations, could easily be psychosomatic, triggered by anxiety and amplified through social suggestion. Once a few girls began exhibiting fits, others followed suit, consciously or not, swept up in the hysteria. In a world where the devil was considered a real and present danger, these symptoms were interpreted not as stress or illness, but as evidence of witchcraft. Another widely discussed theory is the possibility of ergot poisoning. Ergot is a toxic fungus that can grow on rye in damp conditions and is known to cause symptoms very similar to those reported in Salem: seizures, hallucinations, vomiting, and a sense of being pinched or pricked. Some historians suggest that a contaminated grain harvest could have led to accidental ingestion of ergot, producing LSD-like effects among the afflicted. This theory is intriguing because it offers a physical explanation for the bizarre behavior, particularly during the early stages of the trials. However, it doesn't fully account for the selective nature of the accusations, nor the political and personal motivations that shaped who was targeted. That leads to another major factor: socioeconomic and political motives. Salem was not just spiritually divided, but also fractured along economic and familial lines. The Putnam family, key accusers in the trials, were prominent in Salem Village and had long-standing feuds with the more commercially successful and progressive Porters of Salem Town. Accusations of witchcraft became a powerful weapon in settling land disputes and power struggles. Those aligned with the Porters were more likely to be accused. Those with the Putnams often did the accusing. The trials, then, were not just a result of belief in the supernatural, but also a calculated means of removing rivals and reshaping local power structures. Finally, misogyny and gender dynamics played a crucial role. The overwhelming majority of those accused and executed were women. Many were older, widowed, or socially marginalized. Others simply didn't conform to traditional female roles. They were outspoken, independent, or associated with healing, practices that clashed with Puritan orthodoxy. In this sense, the trials can be seen as a form of social control, a reaction to women who threatened the rigid gender norms of the time. By branding them witches, society could strip them of power, voice, and agency. This pattern wasn't unique to Salem, but reflected a broader historical trend of punishing nonconforming women across cultures and eras. Together, these theories paint a picture not of a single cause, but of an explosive convergence of fear, repression, rivalry, and prejudice. The Salem witch trials weren't just about the supernatural. They were about power, who had it, who wanted it, and who would be destroyed to protect it. Beyond the dramatic trials and executions, the Salem witch trials hold a trove of lesser-known and deeply revealing details, stories that complicate the traditional narrative and shed light on the motivations, regrets, and secrets buried beneath the hysteria. One of the most pivotal figures in the entire episode was Tituba, an enslaved woman of likely indigenous and African descent, owned by Reverend Samuel Parris. Her confession is often cited as the spark that ignited the full-blown witchcraft panic, but her testimony was far from straightforward. Under intense pressure, likely including physical coercion, Tituba confessed not only to being a witch, but also spun elaborate tales of black dogs, flying spirits, and a satanic conspiracy. Some historians now view her confession not as an admission of guilt, but as a strategic move for survival. By feeding into the Puritans' expectations and fears, she deflected suspicion away from herself and took control of her narrative in the only way she could. Her elaborate stories also expanded the scope of the trials, helping to justify the authorities' increasingly broad crackdown. Cotton Mather's role in the Salem witch trials remains one of the more ambiguous and controversial aspects of the entire episode, marked not so much by overt action as by his selective silence and shifting tone. As a prominent Puritan minister and intellectual figure in colonial New England, Mather held significant sway over public thought and religious doctrine. Early in the crisis, he lent his moral authority to the court's proceedings, advocating for a firm response to what he perceived as a genuine spiritual threat. He did not outright instigate the trials, but his writings, especially memorable Providences, relating to witchcrafts and possessions, 1689, laid ideological groundwork that legitimized the notion that satanic forces could physically and spiritually manifest in the community, often through spectral means. Mather supported the use of spectral evidence, the idea that a person's spirit could appear in a victim's vision or dream, even though such evidence was intangible and unverifiable. His stance helped bolster the legitimacy of the court's controversial practices, giving theological weight to the claim that witches could harm others through spiritual projection. However, as the trials progressed and the executions mounted, public sentiment began to shift. The sheer number of accusations, the social prominence of some of the accused, and the gruesome nature of the punishments began to raise doubts among both the general public and members of the clergy. Cotton Mather's initial enthusiasm for the trials faded into a studied reticence. Though he never publicly recanted his earlier support, he conspicuously refrained from defending the trials in later writings, and his tone grew more measured, if not entirely repentant. This silence becomes all the more significant when contrasted with the position taken by his father, Increase Mather, another towering figure in Puritan society. In 1693, Increase published Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits, a pointed critique of the legal proceedings in Salem. Most notably, he condemned the use of spectral evidence, arguing that it was better for 10 witches to go free than for one innocent person to be condemned unjustly, a marked departure from the fervor that had defined the trials. This public disavowal signaled a broader reevaluation of the events among the colony's intellectual and religious elite. Cotton's own silence in this period suggests a complicated internal reckoning. Whether it reflected personal regret, political calculation, or theological uncertainty, it marked a departure from the fiery convictions that had helped ignite the trials. His unwillingness to fully confront or account for his earlier influence has left historians speculating about the extent of his belief in the justice of the court's actions. In the end, Cotton Mather's legacy is a cautionary tale, not of overt villainy, but of how silence and ambiguity, particularly from those in power, can perpetuate harm when clarity and moral courage are most needed. Another layer to the tragedy lies in the hidden motivations of the accusers. Many of the most vocal were teenage girls, including Abigail Williams and Ann Putnam Jr. While their behavior is often explained through religious hysteria or psychological stress, some scholars suggest boredom, attention-seeking, and even manipulation by adults played key roles. In a society where young women had little power, their sudden elevation as seers who could detect witches gave them unprecedented influence. Meanwhile, families like the Putnams may have encouraged or guided the accusations for political or financial gain, weaponizing their children's visions to remove rivals or acquire disputed land. Perhaps the most poignant facts are those that came after the trials ended. In the early 1700s, as the full horror of the events settled over New England, a wave of apologies emerged. Ann Putnam Jr. publicly admitted in 1706 that she had been misled and had wrongfully accused innocent people. Others followed suit. The colony itself attempted reparations. Financial compensation was awarded to some of the survivors and families of the executed, though it could never fully atone for the trauma inflicted. These late efforts to repair the damage revealed a deep collective guilt that lingered long after the fires of hysteria were extinguished. These lesser-known facts don't just add intrigue, they reveal the human complexity behind the Salem Witch Trials. They remind us that history is rarely black and white, and that even in the darkest moments there are threads of strategy, remorse, and resistance woven into the fabric of fear. The Salem Witch Trials, though a tragic and horrifying chapter in American history, left a profound and lasting imprint on the development of legal principles, societal values, and the broader national consciousness. In the immediate aftermath of the trials, there was a wave of public shame and reflection, particularly among the Puritan leaders who had been involved in the proceedings. The brutal executions, the miscarriages of justice, and the irreversible harm caused by the mass hysteria forced many to reconsider the foundations upon which such a crisis had been allowed to unfold. This reckoning, however painful, helped to shape some of the most crucial aspects of the American justice system. 1. Of the most significant long-term effects of the Salem witch trials was the evolution of the legal standard of evidence. The use of spectral evidence, where the testimony of witnesses about seeing the spirits of the accused, often in visions or dreams, was considered valid proof of guilt, was a pivotal factor in the miscarriages of justice during the trials. After the trials, this type of evidence was widely discredited, and it became a cornerstone of American legal thought, that accusations without physical evidence or credible testimony should not be used to justify a conviction. The horror of seeing innocent people executed based on the flimsy foundations of spectral and dubious testimonies contributed to the development of stronger rules of evidence in courts, requiring tangible proof and establishing the principle that the accused is innocent until proven guilty. The shift away from allowing unsubstantiated claims, such as those based on fear and superstition, would later become central to the establishment of legal frameworks in the United States, such as those outlined in the Bill of Rights. The Salem trials also helped to foster an awareness of the dangers of mass hysteria and the consequences of abandoning rational judgment in favor of groupthink and collective fear. The overwhelming influence of religion and the social pressures to conform led to the blind acceptance of unfounded accusations, and the trials became a symbol of how fear-driven societies can spiral into dangerous patterns of behavior. This lesson echoed throughout American history, influencing the broader societal values of individual rights, due process, and the need for protection from unjust persecution. In particular, the trials provided a cautionary tale about the potential dangers of merging religion with governance, underscoring the importance of maintaining a separation between church and state, an idea that would later be codified in the U.S. Constitution. In a broader cultural sense, the legacy of Salem became a powerful symbol of the dangers of scapegoating and the persecution of marginalized groups. The trials primarily targeted women, and the majority of those accused of witchcraft were women, often those who were seen as social outcasts or who defied conventional gender roles. Over time, the trials came to represent the destructive power of patriarchal structures and the ways in which fear and prejudice could be used to control and silence women. The witch trials would eventually become part of the larger American narrative around justice and civil liberties, contributing to the advocacy for women's rights and the ongoing struggle for equality and social justice. Additionally, the Salem witch trials became a touchstone in the national consciousness. As American democracy began to take shape, the trials were cited as an example of what could happen when legal systems were undermined by hysteria, bias, and an absence of reason. The trials have been referenced throughout U.S. history, from the McCarthyism of the 1950s, when fear of communism led to widespread accusations and blacklisting, to modern debates about civil liberties, the rule of law, and the protection of the innocent. In essence, the Salem witch trials were more than just an episode of mass panic. They were a catalyst for profound change in the way America thought about justice, evidence, and the protection of individual rights. Though the immediate aftermath was filled with regret and sorrow, the trial's legacy ultimately helped to shape a more enlightened and rigorous legal system, grounded in fairness, skepticism of baseless claims, and an enduring commitment to the principles of due process and human dignity. The lessons learned from Salem continue to resonate today, reminding us of the importance of safeguarding justice against the forces of fear and superstition. One of the most profound legal shifts was the rejection of spectral evidence, or testimony, based on dreams, visions, or unseen forces. During the trials, many people were condemned solely on claims that their spirit had appeared to someone in a dream or vision, evidence that could neither be proven nor disproven. The eventual recognition of how unreliable and dangerous this type of evidence was laid the groundwork for the strict evidentiary standards now expected in modern courts. Salem became a cautionary tale about the consequences of accepting accusations without proof, a lesson that helped influence the future requirement for concrete, observable evidence in judicial proceedings. Equally important was the way Salem helped inspire the concept that would later become a cornerstone of the American legal system: innocent until proven guilty. In Salem, the presumption worked in reverse. Those accused were expected to confess or face execution, and silence or denial often resulted in a death sentence. The absence of due process and the reliance on confessions under duress highlighted the need for a legal structure that protected the rights of the accused rather than presuming guilt. This reversal of logic haunted later generations and contributed to a growing belief in fair trials, legal representation, and the right to remain silent without consequence, principles enshrined in the U.S. Constitution more than a century later. Beyond the courtroom, the Salem witch trials had a psychological and cultural impact that helped shape America's broader views on mass hysteria and scapegoating. It became a textbook example of what happens when fear overrides reason, and when communities turn inward, blaming the vulnerable rather than confronting systemic problems. This theme would echo throughout later American history, from McCarthyism to modern-day moral panics. Salem stands as a stark warning about the dangers of groupthink, religious extremism, and the human tendency to seek simple answers in moments of chaos. In the centuries that followed, Salem became a powerful symbol, not just of injustice, but of the evolution of justice itself. The trials are now studied in schools, dramatized in literature and film, and memorialized as a turning point in America's moral and legal journey. The pain and mistakes of 1692 are not forgotten. They have become a guide for how to build a more just and thoughtful society, one where truth must be proven and fear is never allowed to rule unchecked. The Salem Witch Trials serve as a haunting reminder of how fear, suspicion, and groupthink can unravel the very fabric of society. In today's world, we might like to think we're immune to such mass hysteria. But the events of Salem show us how quickly logic can be overrun by panic and the desire for scapegoats. We live in a time of social media outrage, divisive political movements, and rapid spread of misinformation, echoes of the Salem frenzy where fear can easily morph into destructive behavior. In a world still rife with polarizing beliefs and heightened emotions, the possibility of history repeating itself is something worth considering. So, what can modern society learn from Salem? The importance of critical thinking, the need for fairness in the justice system, and the dangerous power of unchecked fear. These lessons are timeless, reminding us to remain vigilant against the erosion of rationality in moments of societal strain. Could mass hysteria happen again? It's possible. History has shown that, in moments of uncertainty or fear, people can act in irrational, harmful ways. The lessons of Salem urge us to safeguard against this by fostering better understanding, communication, and respect for due process. Now, we want to hear from you. What do you think caused the Salem Witch Trials, and could something like this happen in our time? Share your theories in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going and reflect on how we can prevent history from repeating itself. If this shocked you, hit like and subscribe for more untold history. You don't want to miss our deep dive into history's darkest moments. For more chilling tales, check out our video on witch hunts in Europe, or learn the shocking truth behind the Spanish Inquisition. You won't believe the history they don't teach in school. See you in the next video.